Build your career with CMI confidence? Well, it all starts with the tools at your fingertips. CMI creates workplaces full of inspiring leaders with its on-demand resources, network of mentors and industry-leading accreditations. Search CMI Confidence today.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Rethinking Leadership Amidst Global Crisis digital event. My name is Mary Bolawale, and I am an events coordinator at CMI. Don't forget to join the conversation by using the live chat box, and we'll answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. I will now hand over to Catherine Mishka, Deputy Chair, Diversity and Inclusion Lead for the CMI East Midlands and East region to begin today's event.
Thanks, Mary, and hello and welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So today's event is to discuss how we as leaders and managers can rethink leadership amidst global crises. So we have a perpetual growth which has driven global sustainability crisis, so climate emergency, deforestation, mineral extraction, pollution. We're here to discuss with an ex-colleague and a friend of mine how we as leaders can rethink what growth looks like, sustainable growth. So I'm joined today by Richard Chapman, who is a partner at April Strategy with 25 years of experience in blue chip industries and consulting. Richard also has got a huge passion for sustainability and helping his clients to know and understand their responsibility for growth and to the wider stakeholders, including society and the planet. So without further ado, Richard, welcome.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Lovely to see you. Good afternoon, everybody.
Would you like to, before we kick off the event, Rich, would you just like to give a little bit more of give yourself a little intro, and then we'll get into it?
Yeah, certainly. So good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here. Yeah, Richard Chapman. I'm one of the partners at April Strategy. I've been working in innovation and new product development for 25 years. I'm a product development scientist by background. Started my career in Unilever, and then I moved from product development into category development, which sounds like a minor change, but it's actually the change from actually getting, how do I get something to work to how do I get somebody to buy something they've never bought before. And that got me into the whole world of marketing and innovation, behavioral economics, and I've sort of been consulting in that area for the last 15, 16 years.
Super. Well, thanks very much. And so we'll kick off. So what we'll do, Richard, we'll start with some of the main event, and then we'll move on towards the end of the session. We'll get into some questions from the audience. So I guess to kick off, Rich, from your perspective, how have you seen the challenge of growth change over the duration of your career so far?
Well, it's funny. I always like to say that I started my career at the end of the 1900s. That makes it sound like a nice long time ago. And I guess it's a reasonable time. It's about 30 years. So, in demographic terms, that's almost a generation. I actually heard something the other day, which maybe do a bit of a double take. If Back to the Future was set now, Marty McFly would travel back to 1994. So I had to have a little bit of a sit down when I heard that. It was a very optimistic time back then. I mean, the world seemed full of opportunity. We had this new thing coming along called the internet, and that looked very promising, looked like it was going to be quite important. And there was a sense that it was bringing the world together. And leadership back then seemed to be about picking the right opportunity, as though there were so many opportunities to grow. We had tiger economies and BRIC countries and massive developing markets like Nigeria and Turkey and Mexico. There was a big McKinsey paper, I think early 2010s, a $30 trillion decathlon for the emerging middle classes. There were just all these opportunities to grow, to increase sales. And that sort of classic economist line graph of revenue increasing over time, that had just appeared true. It's a very appealing, it's a very simple model. But it's important to remember that while it appears to be an economic or a financial tool, in its simplest, purest form, that graph is just a reflection of something much more tangible than economic value. It's a change to that line means there's been a change to human behavior somewhere. because growth's a pretty simple concept. There's only three really ways you can grow revenue as an organization. You can get more people to buy you. So they stop buying this one, start buying that one. That's penetration. You can sell to them more often. So, I used to buy twice a year. Now I buy 3 times a year. That's frequency. Or you get them to spend more when you do. Either you buy more, you buy bigger, or you buy a more expensive version. Premiumization. Now those sort of as levers of growth and the human behavior that drives them, it kind of hasn't changed. Maybe the balance has changed a little bit. So if we do zoom right out and go, look at slightly more historical shifts and look over a larger time period. If you go back about maybe you've got 100 years, right? The challenge of growth back then was one of scale. If you could make more, you could sell more. And early competitive advantage came from being able to make products of reproducible quality in large numbers. And often companies put the owner's name on it as a marker of quality. Think Johnny Walker and Kellogg's and Ford and things like that. Then after a while, making things at scale kind of was the norm and was kind of easy. If you could afford to build a factory, you could make stuff. So the challenge then became one of distribution, and competitive advantage came from getting your products around the world. There's a lovely, I'm never quite sure if it's apocryphal or not, but the story behind Johnny Walker and its early success is that he put his product in empty tea clippers that were going out to the East Indies and the West Indies, so that when the sailors got to the bars in these places, Johnny Walker was already there. And that's how it became one of the world's first global brands. It may or may not be true.
Nice story.
Yeah, post-World War II, into the 50s and 60s, 2 big things: the invention of the shipping container and cheap air travel. And suddenly you could get, if you could afford it, your product anywhere in the world. So growth no longer was about distribution. It was about recognition. It was about knowing what this product was. And competitive advantage actually came from being able to communicate why your product was better or different. And, there's lots of pretty functional, this one washes whiter than that and all those sorts of things. And it was the golden age of advertising and differentiation and broadcast in the 50s and 60s. Then choice proliferated, and the challenge of growth was one of preference. You just had all these messages and just bombarded with choice, and we as consumers could choose what to listen to and ignore the stuff that didn't kind of mean anything to us. It didn't connect with us. So actually, understanding more about your target was key. And toward the end of the sort of 20th century, competitive advantage came from access to information about people and actually get data and insight and knowing more about your target than anyone else. Nowadays, of course, information is democratized. Everybody can access information about anybody all the time. Our digitized lives and footprints means that the challenge of growth is sort of shifted to actually one of personalization. Competitive advantage comes from being able to act at like the individual level, to personalize, and often in real time. So what's the growth challenge now? But it's certainly been a challenging time. And one of the most significant challenges has been the ability to respond just to the sheer number of external shocks to the system. Just in my career, we've had multiple wars in the Middle East, Asian currency crisis, the late 90s, the dot-com bubble, 9/11, global financial crisis, of course, COVID, invasion of Ukraine, and so on. These are acute global external shocks, and the challenge of growth has been co-opted a bit to be about how to grow during such turbulent times. But aside from the sort of human misery of these sorts of things, one of the most almost unspoken effects of these continual acute challenges is they've drowned out a chronic challenge, which is the climate emergency alarm, and that's now impossible to ignore. That classic economist graph of revenue increasing over time is now being openly challenged for its fundamental weakness, in that it implies an open-ended system, one that can continue to grow in perpetuity, which of course is nonsense, and is rightly coming under intense scrutiny. You think Professor Kate Raworth's done economics, Jason Hickel's work on degrowth, those sort of things. What it all adds up to is that we're now in a place where the challenge of growth is that growth as an objective is being challenged. It's quite a big deal.
And I guess it's what does growth look like moving forward? So, you rightly say that the old economic models are based on perpetual unfettered growth. And I guess at the time that they were developed, the macroeconomic models, that those parameters were held true. So we now know that those models, are unsustainable with finite resource, which obviously Kate Raworth's done economics talks to very, visually. So if the objective of sort of unfettered growth is now being questioned, and we know it's not sustainable, so what sort of challenges does that create for leaders? And So how can leaders kind of be the architects of more sustainable growth and rethink some fundamental sort of ideas about products and services?
Yeah, I mean, it does create, understandably, a lot of challenges, because it does underpin, 99% of the organisations that exist today. So we have to try and break these challenges down into some themes. We can think about it in probably three levels. So there's the strategic level, the operational level, and then the human level. The most obvious then are the strategic one. So if we go back to that graph, revenue against time. As time goes on, revenue increases. Pretty simple. And strategy is about choices. The strategic choices companies make drives the shape of that line. Where's the revenue going to come from? How much will there be? How quickly can we access it? All that sort of thing. They're strategic choices. And they're driven by lots of things, not least of which is your competitive position, the ambition of stakeholders, microeconomics, politics, and so on. But those choices have, until I think relatively recently, largely ignored a critical third dimension. So we now have to imagine a sort of Z axis coming up vertically out of the page, which is impact. And the further along that revenue timeline you go, the further off the page the line lifts. And by not acknowledging and assessing the implications of this third dimension, impact, organizations are not only overlooking a source of serious strategic risk, they're in danger of making choices that will make the climate emergency and environmental breakdown even worse, which in turn increases the strategic risk. It's sort of a circular argument. So that's at the strategic level, right? At a more operational level, it's raising all sorts of questions about the nature of the products and services, experiences an organization should be looking at and pursuing. I mean, go into the supermarket, you'll find 30 types of honey. There's 50 types of insurance and 60 different booking options. So what can credibly come next? What do we need? Are we meeting unmet needs, or are we creating needs to meet? What's all this consumption for? It isn't necessarily to make people happy. I found an amazing article recently from a professor of ecological economics in Lausanne called Julia Steinberger. And she's shown that consumption and well-being are correlated, but only up to a certain point. And after that, they are inversely correlated. Then there was some data I saw on from the US Bureau of Economic Affairs. Yeah. So this was data on US state GDP and loneliness by US states. And when they combine, they show a direct positive correlation between the two. States with the highest GDP tend to have the highest loneliness. And it sort of begs the question, what does a good idea look like nowadays? Suddenly the answer isn't as obvious as it used to be. There are more features, better service, faster delivery, all the things that were previously known to be drivers of value must now also be seen as drivers of cost in the widest possible term, not just cost to you, but cost to the system you exist in. So that's at the operational level. Finally, then at the human level, suddenly we as managers and leaders, well, we don't know what the future looks like. There's no right answer, no certainty. It's not sort of black and white share gain driving. We do this and we'll win, top line growth delivering kind of traditional approach. Is grey. And people don't like grey. They like black and white. They like the simplicity. And systems like simplicity. They like absolute numbers and controls and processes. So for most organizations, that uncertainty is very scary. What you've known and been successful at is being sort of superseded or even becoming potentially irrelevant. And it comes with the additional challenge for those who are trying to provide leadership in these uncertain times, because others are looking to you as a leader to know, to direct, to guide. But if you don't know, well, what are you supposed to do? We see the strategy cycle speeding up, meaning we're not able to set long-term goals at precisely the time we need to be looking further ahead. There are uncertainties everywhere. Everyone talks about transformation, but no one can say what they should be transforming to. And by the way, when you've transformed, you'll need to do it again. There's that great quote about how things have never changed this slowly and they'll never change this slow again. And you're supposed to navigate through all this. It's pretty tough, and it puts enormous pressures on organizations and on individuals.
Yeah, there's that, that's interesting that, the strategy cycle where and the planning cycle, 3 years, 5 years now, we have to, that's significantly shorter. It's emergent strategy. It's much more agile and sort of almost on the hoof, isn't it? So, so I guess sort of picking up on your highlighting the fact that we've got this sort of, we're living in uncertain times. It's a curse, I think, is it not? May you live in uncertain times. So we live in uncertain times. We've got an uncertain future. So how do we build, like as individuals and managers and leaders, the resilience we require to deal with that level of uncertainty that you just mentioned? And how can we effectively lead our organizations without that historic certainty that, you know, leaders were looked to as sort of at the vanguard of their organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a bit of a $64 million question. What makes a good leader? Now, it's interesting. There are loads of lists out there about what good leadership is. I mean, if you Google it, you'll get lots of nice words, and it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. I found one from Gartner from 2022, which I thought was quite nice, because it just said there's 3 things, right? Good leaders have authenticity, empathy, and adaptability. Okay, well, that sounds good, right? Sounds achievable. Well, I think we're going to touch on some of these, because I think in the environment I just described, and we're living in, one with all that change and challenge, they can actually be pretty hard to achieve. There are some very specific things about the environment now that make it harder. And again, we try and break it down a bit, make it a bit more manageable. And the first thing, so what we challenge ourselves, we understand, is what are you trying to lead? Because there's probably 4 domains of leadership to think about. There's leadership of yourself, there's leading teams, there's leading the organization, and then leading beyond the organization. So if we focus on the things that are probably most familiar to people on the call, you know, leading teams and leading the organization, the way we like to summarize the key shift that's needed in today's environment is being less reliant on what we call command and control leadership. We have to sort of start with the recognition that you can't control things, and you shouldn't pretend you can. The more you profess to know what's coming, that you know what the answer is, that you're in charge, the less believable you sound, basically. There's a very famous quote from a US president, I can't remember which one it is, planning is essential, but all plans are useless. I prefer the Mike Tyson quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Change is inevitable. You're going to get punched in the face. So what's important is being able to respond to that change. You need to be happy relinquishing control and accepting that uncertainty. Which can be uncomfortable for leaders and for management structures and systems. But there are some useful ways of working and thinking that leaders and managers can adopt and encourage in their teams. Some of the thinking in the world of agile, which you touched on briefly then, really helps, because that's based on not knowing exactly what the end point will look like, but creating the conditions to try, to learn, to pivot, to use that terribly overused word. So that's what we call climate control leadership, not command and control leadership. It's about a willingness to try new things and kind of the growth mindset, which we all like to hear about, and a tolerance of good enough over perfection. I don't know what you think of Jeff Bezos, but he had a great quote a few years ago, which is high velocity decision making beats high quality decision making, which I kind of like. Agile means being able to live with and accept uncertainty and ambiguity of setting, but then changing priorities. And that's one of the reasons it's become, you know, so popular over the last 5 or 10 years outside of its home of software development. Now, an important element and a sort of key implication of being more agile is fostering a culture of creativity and collaboration, and encouraging those skills and competencies in people, in your staff. But with that actually comes a willingness to be wrong, or at least to be less wedded to the need to be right. I'm sure lots of people have seen the great educator Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk, and the quote that always sticks in my mind from that is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you will never create anything new. Now, that's something that leaders can model in themselves and encourage in others. There's another great quote from Peter Norvig, from the director of research at Google. He talked about politicians and engineers. If you're a politician, admitting you're wrong is a weakness. But if you're an engineer, you essentially want to be wrong half the time. You know, if you do experiments and you're always right, you're not learning anything, you're not getting any information out of it. So we need to think like engineers, not politicians. So, you know, you can ask yourself, when was the last time you were comfortable with being wrong in your team or in your organization? Is being wrong recognized? Is it rewarded? Is it punished? Is it just forgotten about? So that's kind of, you know, some of the team and organization dynamics. If we think a little bit bigger now and step out a bit and think about leading beyond the organization, I think there's a greater need to be able to monitor and be aware of the trends and dynamics in the external environment, because they are changing so quickly, to interpret what it might mean for your organization, and do this more regularly. As exactly as you said, Catherine, the days of 5-year strategy review after 3, it's probably long gone for the majority of companies. Now that's important because it actually creates more opportunity to engage with and affect your environment rather than just respond to it. Because you're engaging with it more regularly, you can help lead it, you can shape it, because no organization exists in a silo. So as we recognize more and more the ecosystem in which, you know, an organization exists, we realize that leaders can influence and impact beyond your organization through broader contextual understanding and stakeholder relations. I mean, donor economics, we've talked about it a couple of times. Kate Raworth talks about organizations being distributive by design, distributing the power and the value more equitably across the ecosystem the business operates in. Now, that sounds very noble and perhaps a bit idealistic. So what does that look like? Well, I'll give you an example. One of our big B2B clients, their turnover is like £750 million or something here in the UK. They've got a terrific and a highly ethical purpose, which we'll talk about purpose in a moment, I think. It's fully committed to, it's very public about it, but it faces a reputational risk in being so public because it can't realistically achieve that purpose on its own, and it can't achieve it with its current customer base. Some of its customers' activities or operations will help it achieve that purpose, and others hold it back or even undermine it. So our clients are looking at ways of identifying and encouraging customers who can help it achieve its purpose, working more closely with them, because if that customer succeeds, it has a greater chance of achieving its purpose. It's also enabling them to have challenging conversations with the customers who run operations or existing categories that are counter to that purpose. You might think it's the equivalent of scope 3 or scope 4 emissions. If your organization enables another to behave badly, well, are you partly responsible? Having those sorts of discussions, that takes courage. That's leadership.
And that's interesting, actually, Rich, because, supply chain management, there has been a focus over time, failures of supply chains and supply chain insecurity, but actually to turn it on its head and help clients and organizations look forward and say, actually, you are in the supply chain to your customers. So how do you behave and how do you act it forward, not pay it forward, but, that concept.
You're absolutely right. Scope 3, everyone's thinking about scope 3 and looking up the value chain. In the business to business world, you need to be looking down it as well, because you are supplying others. And actually, by being quite open about the network that you exist in, you are actually starting to address some of the issues at a greater level, a more meta level.
I guess I just there's a couple of bits I've just noted on that to reflect. I think is really important to really take away from that, and that is the being happy. So leadership, being happy to relinquish control and being happy to know that we don't know the answers. And so, we talked about being agile with a small a, or and being able to pivot, and also to be able to create the sort of culture of creativity and collaboration, and being willing to be wrong. And that, as leaders and managers, that requires a sense of psychological safety. So to allow people to be wrong as well, doesn't it? So there's a whole load of stuff that we can unpick from what you've and things that we can take away from those, some of those elements we've just talked about. So I guess following on from that, you've talked to, well, you and I've just mentioned sort of leading teams and organizations and beyond the organization. So what about specifically leading ourselves? So what sort of personal issues might we as leaders and managers experience when we consider the challenge of organizational growth in the current climate?
Yeah, and I think you touched on some of it exactly there. I mean, just by saying, we need to relinquish control and we need to kind of be more open mindset and all those sorts of things, you're already leaning into some of the things. And there's so much we can unpick. I think there are some of those obvious things which I've just covered, but there's something much more fundamental going on here as well. So at the sort of more obvious end, the courage and the willingness to be wrong and adaptability, that sort of thing, they're all important. And they can be quite challenging, but they probably sound pretty familiar to most people. It's not rocket science. No one's going to deny these sort of things are important and helpful. And I heard Simon Sinek talked about what drives success in known versus unknown circumstances. So in known circumstances, it's about skill and knowledge and experience. But we've already said we're not in known circumstances. We're in unknown circumstances. We're in the latter. So there, it's all about your approach and your attitudes and your mindsets, curiosity, agility, courage, and all that sort of, and that's what drives outcomes now. So if you found those sorts of things challenging, if your organizations or you have traditionally sort of relied on past skills and experience, believing that more of the same will get you through all this turbulence, it can be pretty worrying when you start to realize or question, is that still the case? Things are only getting harder and it might feel quite exposing. Now, when things feel exposing, that can result in some unpleasant behavior, so some defensive behaviors, quite dismissive sometimes, or at its worst, destructive, because it takes a certain level of honesty to front into this, and it's not the sort of honesty where you tell others exactly what you think of them. It's honesty with yourself.
Yeah.
Anyone who's read or listened to Brené Brown's work on vulnerability will know what I'm talking about. The definition of living in uncertain times is that you don't know. Now, being able to say, I don't know, shows that vulnerability. And it also shows people that you're open to finding out. It's a really positive opportunity for people to show the sort of vulnerability it takes to be a truly authentic leader. So that's kind of at the more obvious level. As I said, though, there's something much more fundamental going on here, a bigger issue, if you like. So the issue revolves around our own personal values and beliefs, what we see and do and worry about in our personal lives, and what we see and do and worry about in our professional lives. I recently spoke to a lady called Dr. Victoria Hirth at Cambridge University. She calls herself a pracademic, which I quite like. And she describes something very similar to this in terms of the micro, meso, and macro worlds. So the macro world is the environment, everything around us, and it's absolutely impossible to not notice the climate emergency, the fires and floods and storms and biodiversity loss and so on. That's the macro world. The micro world is our personal values and behaviors, and many of us will have taken steps, to do our bit, recycle, maybe eat a bit less meat, try to fly less, electric cars, solar panels, that sort of thing. The meso world is the organizations we work in, and they're in danger of being trapped in the middle. Because I'll bet a fair amount of money that most people on this call have taken steps to reduce their personal environmental impact. If you've got children at school, they're being taught about the macro environment they see and are inspired by the Greta Thunbergs and David Attenboroughs, and they might be encouraging or forcing you to change your micro world, walking to school and recycling. But they might also ask you what you do in your meso world, the organization you in. What do you do for a living? Well, what do you say? Well, I dig stuff out of the ground and burn it, or I make small plastic things that never biodegrade, or I chop down forests so I can plant monocultures. Right? I'm exaggerating, but even if you aren't directly involved in these sorts of things, somewhere in your value or supply chain, you probably are. So if you're trying to do your best in your personal life, the micro world, because you're very concerned about the macro world, but you work in an industry and organization that, frankly, could do better in how it treats the world, it can lead to a sort of cognitive dissonance. It's almost doublethink, where you separate the issues, or you create a sort of self-justification as a defense. Now, thinking and behaving in one way in your micro world, and then thinking and behaving in a completely different way in your meso world, is not likely to lead to high levels of integrity. And if you haven't got much integrity, how are you going to be a leader? So in this context, if we think about authentic leadership again, what it demands is the ability to question what you're doing and why. Which brings us back to purpose, which I mentioned earlier. We're seeing a shift in the use of purpose. While it's been, very popular and trendy to set a purpose for organization to align behind for a long time, to sort of gee the troops, I'd argue it's been under the shadow of, or even in service of, the sort of Milton Friedman interpretation of the world, in that the purpose of business is to make money.
Yeah.
Now, increasingly, we're seeing purpose being used at a higher, more what I call meta level, where organizations exist to serve society as a whole, which may sound a bit woolly, but it doesn't sound woolly to the British Standards Institute, because they've recently published PAS 808, the Public Available Information 808, which is all about being a purpose-driven organization and how to do it. Victoria Hirth, who I mentioned earlier, she's the technical author for that specification. And although it's probably not that well known at the moment, I have some optimism that could be a powerful tool for organizations that are challenging themselves, their ownership structures, and their investors to more closely examine why they exist. I was lucky enough to chat with Erin Sahan at the Donut Economics Action Lab a while ago, and he reminded me that businesses don't have a right to exist. They're going to be under increasing pressure to justify their existence, not just to society, but to their sources of finance. Someone at the World Economic Forum spoke at a sustainability event I was at last year, and he mentioned research they've done amongst CEOs that said 40% of CEOs think their organizations won't be viable in 10 years' time without transformation. That's a lot, right? This is not fringe anymore. This is mainstream. That's
in 10 years' time, almost half of organizations will no longer be viable.
Yeah, without some form of transformation. And I go back to transformation. Is transformation an endpoint? I'm going to transform to this, to that, or is transformation, a process that's entirely ongoing? Open question.
I mean, and with my sort of background in transformation as well, it's getting people to move from the concept of like incremental change to transformation, which is a fundamental paradigm shift, right? And it's getting organizations to understand the difference there. What I've made quite a lot of notes, and so obviously for our listeners, what we will do is we'll gather some of the names and references, and we'll circulate those after the fact. So loads of things for us to think about there, and for our watchers and members. No, it's brilliant. It's really good. Actually, just to sort of a shout out to I'm lucky enough to have joined the inaugural cohort at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership.
Yes, which is Victoria Hurst's program, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to being part of that. I think it starts imminently. So we've talked about the challenges. So I guess now let's look at the flip side and say, what are the opportunities that this situation creates for managers and leaders? So what's the positives out of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're always in danger of it coming across as incredibly scary and woeful and really intimidating, and despite the level of challenge and the scary nature of facing into some of them, if we acknowledge that change is inevitable, there are two broad opportunities. Now, the first is I think there is now a massive opportunity for leaders and managers to make a difference. To stand up and be counted. Think about what your options actually are. If you find a gap between what you do professionally and what you believe in personally, you've basically got one of three choices. You can change what you do, i.e. change jobs, which is not always practical. And unless you go and live, off grid somewhere, you aren't actually escaping the system anyway. You can change what you believe in, your principles, like Groucho Marx. These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. Well, that doesn't sound like the basis of a leader with high integrity either. Or you can change the organization. And the reality, of course, is the first two don't solve the problem. They just make it someone else's. So the really exciting opportunity for us as professional leaders and managers is to create the conditions for change, to make a difference. I was speaking with one of the senior directors for Cirque du Soleil recently. And like most large performing arts shows, they're taking lots of steps to reduce the impact of their individual touring shows. And you probably saw Coldplay monitoring and publishing their carbon footprint of their tours. So he's challenging the organization to balance Cirque du Soleil's purpose, which is invoke, provoke, evoke, which I thought was very nice. Balance that purpose with the pressure that growth and more shows puts on the performers and the hundreds of technicians and specialists involved. These are very human considerations. He's having challenging conversations from a position of care and concern and vulnerability rather than one of power. He's incredibly honest in addressing the implications of growth for them. And it feels like a different type of leadership, one that's kind of driven by an intention to do the right thing, and who doesn't want that? As an individual, most of us can't solve the environmental and sustainability crisis. But as professionals, we can encourage a sort of group action that's more likely to succeed and make a difference. It's how industrial action and revolutions work, right? One person leaving is easier to ignore, but if everyone down tools and left, you're pretty certain that things will change pretty quickly. I'm not suggesting we all do that. So, okay, how do you create the conditions for change? We know change is hard, and it's not simply a case of lining up all the right elements in the right order and pressing go. But we also know there are things that we can do to make it easier, or at least give it a better chance of success. The key is to think of change as a human challenge again, not a technical one. And like, as I said, organic growth and revenue growth is a result of behavior change in consumers. What we're talking about is a change in how people behave in your organization. So if you believe that different behaviors lead to different outcomes, you have to understand where the behaviors come from. Now, again, loads of interesting work in this area. I really like, there's a guy called Alan Watkins. He's a neuroscientist and physician and executive coach. And he talks about how behaviors are a result of what people think. And what people think is driven by what people feel. And what people feel is a result of their emotions. So we need to change emotions to change the outcome. We need to inspire people with a story that they can champion and believe in. We need to free them from the fear of repercussions, and we can reassure them that their changes will make a difference. Now, these are all emotions, and it starts with ourselves as leaders, because the second thing that it presents us with is the opportunity to change ourselves. Again, there's ton of stuff on personal development, and I'm not a massive expert in it. But when it comes down, what it comes down to is a need to challenge how we think. We know that, as you grow up, as a child matures, we change how we think. Child development is very well studied, right? But there's some work done by a Harvard professor of psychology called Robert Keegan that says it doesn't stop there. There is such a thing as adult development. And it kind of starts with recognizing that there are some ways of thinking that are more mature, more sophisticated, you might even say wiser than others. And they're not based on the numbers of years of experience or of a particular skill level. It's based on your ability to think, not do. Now, things like Myers-Briggs and learning styles and all those sorts of things, they're all non-hierarchical, right? No one way is better than another one. But what Robert Keegan's work is based on is that there are hierarchies in how we think. And while it's important to recognize that everyone has a right to be heard and that everyone's opinion is valuable, not everyone's opinion is right, including yours. Now, many of the opinions that we think of as ours are actually formed by the social context in which we operate in, the norms and expectations of the cultures that we live in, including, of course, the norms and expectations of the places where we work, our meso worlds. Now, to challenge them or run counter to them could be thought of as, pretty risky, or rocking the boat. And a lot of the time we don't like to rock the boat, either for psychological reasons, nobody likes being the outsider, but also for very practical reasons. If rocking the boat means you might get kicked out of it, i.e. lose your job, it's understandable that most people aren't willing to do it. So first we have to recognize that these norms exist, and we need to recognize that we are held sway by them. Then we have to be able to see them for what they are, which is limitations on different ways of thinking, blind spots to what might actually be going on. Now, this takes courage and it needs support. That psychological safety you mentioned earlier. We hear a lot about that nowadays. It's not a nice to have. It's sort of not ethereal. It's a prerequisite to be able to confront the misconceptions and dissonance and inadequacies of our own thinking. Because the final step is to take on a problem or a challenge that will exceed the boundaries of your own understanding and expertise, something that you can't solve quickly. Go back to Peter Norvig. If you can solve it quickly, you don't learn anything. The way Robert Keegan discusses it, he says that you're not using your skills and experience to solve this problem. You are using the problem to solve the limitations of your skills and experience. Now, I can't think of a more important and intractable problem for us to be challenging the limitations of our thinking on than the sustainability problem, because sustainability we're talking about is not really the sustainability of your business or your product or your supply chain. It's the sustainability of your way of life. What's more ethical than that?
I think absolutely. I mean, that's I think poignantly, I'm sure I saw a Guardian news flash on my phone that the doomsday clock has been set to something like 90 seconds to midnight.
I saw it was due to be set. I didn't say where it ended up to, but yeah, that would make sense.
So that really drives home what better, or not even better, but what else is it that's more important, I guess.
Exactly, yeah.
I guess it's so that, I mean, that's been again really insightful and helpful. And there's a couple of bits I'd just like to pick up on that people can sort of also take away and have a think about. So we talked about creating conditions for change, and there's some work that Mary Bean did on agile leadership and adaptive space. So that's something people could take away and have a think about, how we as leaders create that adaptive space, which again plays on having psychological safety to try something and not know the answer.
Absolutely, yeah, and not sort of being wedded to the plan and being really dogmatic that this is the plan and this is what we're going to do. Agile leadership is that, well, we're going to get as far as we can go, it was as far as we can see, and then we're going to build it from there. And actually, this again, that I slightly glibly is transformation an endpoint or a process. The idea that you'll get there and everything will be cushy and everything will be solved, again, it's misleading. It's not like that. By the time you'll get there, things have changed again. So what you need to be able to do is to be able to continually change and continually transform and that's that agile adaptive space she talks about. Absolutely.
And it's a sort of it's almost a mindset and a skill set to go through change and transform and to adapt.
It's not something that many people are good at. It's not something you're taught and how to do. You don't get project managed trained in that. You don't learn that in your career. It's very uncomfortable for some people. There are people among us who are completer finishers. They like to get stuff done. They put boxes around things, and there are other people who just like to throw things at the wall. And, it runs counter to some people's skill sets and competencies, and actually understanding the types of skills you might need, or the types of behaviors you reward in an organization. You need to get hold of some of this stuff to try and work out, well, what do I want people to do? How do I want people to feel and behave in my organization?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll move on. I just want to sort of follow that up, but we talk about, so how can you drive change from within? Well, what kind of behavior do we reward in our organization? Do we reward an old style of leadership that stood at the front and said this is absolutely the way forward, or do we reward innovation and creativity and humility and authenticity and being able to test and learn? It's
and that you can be really quite specific about that, because you can look at, yes, which behaviors do I encourage because I've written some values down or some competencies or skills. Who am I promoting? Who are in positions of power? Who's winning in an organization? Because what is measured, people manage to the measure, right? And if they see success in a particular field by acting and behaving in one way, and they want success, that is how you will end up behaving. And actually kind of trying to get a real handle on what behaviors do I want, how do I want people to behave, and how am I rewarding the behaviors that I'm seeing. It can be really, really obvious when you look around.
And I guess in a way, sort of, there's an element of back to sort of an EDI concept as well, that the more different experiences and different insights you have around the table, the more likely you are as an organization to have the ability to respond to environmental changes and black swan events and other emergent.
We're all prisoners of the filters that we have, because of our upbringings and because of our backgrounds and our experiences. So if you're all looking at a problem or a challenge with the same set of filters, you're all going to see the same answer. To someone with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So you need those different perspectives to be able to say, well, actually, we haven't even realized that the problem is over here. Going back to that thing about, the limitations that are placed on your own thinking are there because of your skills and experience, because they exist in a box that's been created because of the experiences you've gone through. And actually, only by breaking them down, only by forcing a different perspective, only by challenging some fundamental assumptions in your own limited skills and experiences, can you create something new. Going back to Ken Robinson's point.
Excellent. I'm conscious of time, so Rich, thank you for that. And we'll move on to some questions. We could talk obviously for hours and hours, but we've got some pre-submitted questions from some other people in the audience. So I'm going to pick up the first one from Eleanor, and Eleanor asks, how do we address the gap that comes from global and government commitments to net zero, green transition, and the operationalization of the commitments across economy and society?
Yeah, very good. Great question. Thank you, Eleanor. Yes, there can often be a lofty chasm. A lofty chasm, can you have that? I don't know, a deep chasm, a lofty peak, whatever, between the sort of very high level, UN sustainability goals and government, net zero by 2030. Okay, well, what do I do? Well, I've changed my light bulbs and I've kind of done the right things. Actually, if I just reiterate that example I gave earlier of our B2B client who's deliberately and consciously saying, look, we can't do this on our own. And the more that you kind of distribute the responsibility and work with organizations that you're partners with, both upstream and downstream and in your local areas, where actually by creating that sort of collective action, by bringing more sort of eyes in on the problem and different levels of perspective and different ways of addressing the same problem, you're magnifying the effect. You can only do this much, but with you and this organization, you can do this much, and suddenly you can get into a more sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, if you like, because I think it is unfair for these lofty goals to be dropped on your desk and say, right, how am I going to eradicate poverty in Africa? I make jelly beans in Newark. It feels a bit too much of a leap. But working as a network, opening up and sort of being less isolationist, this is something that we're really seeing in the last probably 5-10 years, just being much more open and letting people into your organization and going and working with with partner organizations, because you don't have to do it on your own. You can't do it on your own. And that's kind of how we try and close that gap.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll move on to, we've got another question as well from Nigel. So Nigel says, this event will improve awareness of initiatives by the UN and the EU to address climate change and sustainability issues. How extensive is this awareness in the corporate world? We've touched on that, but
yeah, Nigel, it's an interesting question, because I mean, part of me says that in the corporate world, if you're talking multinationals, some of my clients, huge multinationals, they're pretty aware of them, and you'll find them written in their corporate brochures. Is the chartered surveyors on the corner of the street where I live in, are they aware of them? Maybe a bit less. One of the challenges I sometimes think, and I do worry about a little bit in some of the way that sustainability development goals are being used, is there's a slight pick and choose going on here. So one of them is about, eradicate hunger, end world hunger. I think it's the second one, end world hunger. Okay, so but any food manufacturer could put that into their kind of in this thing. Yes, we're doing that because we make we make food. Another one is good health and well-being. Yeah, we're a pharmaceutical company. We make, but it's got nothing to do with how you do it. It's just kind of a little bit lip service. And there's also one which is obviously about economic growth, about creating sustainable economic growth. That is one of the sustainability goals. But actually, so people can sort of say, that it can almost be used as an excuse to do stuff. Oh yeah, because it's aligning to this one. So I think they are well known at the macro in a big world, in sort of the multinationals. I'm not sure they're being used entirely correctly everywhere. And I would question how much they're being used and acknowledged at a more SME level. Okay,
super. Right. Move on to a couple more questions. So I'm going to take this one actually from Ruth, because Ruth says she works in the voluntary sector. Most of the staff are with us because of shared values and purpose, not through making money. What is key to inspiring desire for change in the context of global crises? When we are already very mired in those crises, supporting our service users?
Well, yes. I mean, I do some. I work with the NHS and the VSE sectors here in where I live in Nottingham, and there's an enormous. I think there's an enormous sense of frustration at the very, very frontline issues that those organisations see and engage with. We work with people with severe multiple deprivation, and the again, just an enormous gulf between what you're seeing as issues and what you're able to address in your world as in a VCF organisation is incredibly frustrating, and sometimes I worry that the level with which you're trying to speak, or the level that you're trying to act, again, seems very distant from very lofty and noble goals. So I think trying to harness that need, or that energy, or that kind of desire to make a difference. There are a lot of organisations that kind of don't benefit from that sort of passion. Most organisations that I've worked in don't have that sort of passion, because the need that they're fulfilling doesn't feel as pertinent and as red hot as some of the ones that the organisations I've worked in around here do feel. So trying to close that gap, I think, is the challenge. I don't have a particularly clever answer for it, because I know how tough it is at that frontline service provision level. Trying to borrow some of the language, some of the structures, some of the support mechanisms, some of the ideals to make people feel valued. There is a massive gap, again, between what work is valued, as in how valuable it is, and how well paid it is. Because they are not aligned.
There is a chasm right there. Okay, super. Thanks, Rich. I'm just going to make a note. So Nina asks, a question about what models are available to understand and go through change. So I won't ask you to answer that, Rich, but just to Nina, there's plenty of resources on the CMI website about change and change management.
Yeah, we can make sure we post you some of those. The simplest one, which we've talked about before, is about having a campaign for change, which is about winning hearts and minds. Kind of you need a really good story. It's about having supporters, kind of the people who are going to help you make that change, and it's about plumbing it in at a kind of nuts and bolts level, actually making the process work for you, not against you. Those three things. Have a really good story, have people who are willing to help you and are on your side, and plumb the process in, make it real, hardwire it.
Super. I think we've got time for one last question. So Sean asks, how does the leader organisation respond to the influence of pressure and political groups and media owners on the media's perception of the organisation's policy and strategy?
Wow. How do the leaders organisation respond to the influence of pressure and political groups and media owners on the media's perception of the organisation's policy and strategy? Yeah, well, that's a gnarly one. I think the place that I will always try and bring my clients back to is the reputational risk of not doing things, or of inaction. And it's very easy to put just some nice words on a page and accusations of greenwashing and all those sorts of things. If you have those pressures being put on you, kind of almost unfairly, it feels like what's behind your question is just sort of, you should be doing this and you shouldn't be doing that, and if you don't, I'm going to crucify you in the press. I think that the burden of responsibility you have to actually walk the walk and talk the talk and be very, very open. Again, this idea that if you try and keep your cards too close to your chest, if you try and live in an ivory tower, you're going to be more vulnerable to attack. The more open you are, and the more dialogue you try and set up with some of these pressure groups and political groups, to sort of say, look, this is the reality of the situation. This is how we're working with all our different partners, and actually trying to make sense of the trade-offs that we have to make between, providing food for people and chopping down trees to plant crops. These are real conversations that can't be shied away from. And actually engaging more in them but being very open to it and saying this is what we believe in, and having that purpose that you can then defend and say this is why we're doing it, and being very, 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 very public about it.
And it sort of harks back to the discussion about purpose, doesn't it? Again, so super. So I think we'd better leave it there in terms of questions, because we're now going to, thanks very much, Rich, but hang on, because we're going to carry on shortly. But we're going to bring in David Jones now from CMI.
Hello, thanks, Catherine. Good afternoon. I really enjoyed listening there to your conversation with Richard. So I'm David Jones. I'm Policy and Innovation Manager for the Green Transition here at CMI, where I've been since June. And I previously led on sustainability at the awarding organisation NCFE. So at CMI, we strongly believe that appropriately skilled managers and leaders will be key for the economy and businesses within it to transition to net zero and to navigate global crises. Climate change is driving significant risk in the global economy, so loss of natural resources, increasing security risks, and the growing social and economic disparities. So to challenge our hypothesis across autumn 2023, we worked with the European Sustainability Academy to explore the positive role and practical actions that CMI could pursue to accelerate the green transition. And Catherine was also involved in that work, provided some strategic insight to us. So ESA undertook a deep dive into the perspectives of staff members, policymakers and partners, and they explored how similar bodies are approaching the green transition. And the conclusion was that as CMI, we have an opportunity to take a leadership role here in thought leadership, in our products, in our member services, and our partnerships in defining, advancing, and realizing the expansion of green management skills in the UK and beyond. So from a mission perspective, it's core to our vision of better led and managed organizations in the context of global environmental distress and the need to reduce the material impact of our business also. And we believe that managers and leaders will need green management skills. And we're broadly defining those as the competencies managers will need to effectively deliver organizational and business outcomes in a way that meet legal requirements and wider economic, political, social stakeholder expectations, that we will reduce and reverse our negative impacts on our environment. But they're not only about compliance. So they encompass things like strategy, innovation, stakeholder management, contextual awareness, and much more besides. Obviously, we're aware that as an organization, we have a lot of work to do here to support our managers and leaders. So we'll be doing a deeper dive into researching the green management skills. We'll be reviewing our frameworks based on insight, so research and data, including the labour market intelligence, to make sure that we have the products and services needed to be able to serve our managers and leaders, particularly in times of the global sustainability crisis. And we're going to be looking at what the policy requirements are, so locally, nationally, and we're seeking to work with government and key political stakeholders, particularly this year with an election later in the year, to raise the voice that green management skills are a critical component of net zero and skills policy. To give you an example of some of the things that we're doing at the minute, we sit on the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, their green advisory community, and we were involved in the refresh of the sustainability toolkit. We're members of the City of London Corporation for a Sustainable Skyline task force group. And to reference purpose-driven organizations again, we're on the BSI PAS 808 purpose-driven organizations working group, obviously, which Richard mentioned earlier. And I think to date, as CMI, we've done a lot of work on the social and the governance elements of ESG, and now we're committing to do the same with the environment element. And so we'll be engaging externally with stakeholders as we drive forward with this, and collaboration is key. So we'll be, like I say, doing much more work on this as we move forward.
Thanks, David. And again, that just sort of echoes, Rich, what you said earlier. We can't, none of us can do this on our own. So that the collaboration and reaching out and sort of working together is going to be really key to this. Yeah. I guess to sort of bring the event to wrap it up and to a close. So Rich, what we like to do is we like to ask our speakers to give us their sort of 3 key takeaways for the event, and whether that's sort of a really pertinent bit of information or something that our members and our viewers can go and take away in action. But what would you say are your 3 key takeaways from today?
I think there's 3 things that we could think about, and it's up to you how hard you push some of this stuff. The first one, going right back to the beginning, is just say I don't know a bit more, and get comfortable with being wrong, especially at work, or not knowing. It's not a sign of personal failing or inadequacy. It's a sign of a mind that's still learning. It's still acknowledging there's stuff to go for, and that's a really positive thing. I think the second one, again, perhaps a bit more challenging, but discuss your organization's projected growth over time with your team and managers. And can you agree on what the impact will be? You've got the X and the Y, think about the Z. What is the impact of your projected growth over time? And are you happy with that? Because I think the third thing I would ask everyone to think about is looking inward and sort of explore the gap between what you do for a living and what you do in your personal life. If it's a big gap, what are you going to do about it?
Super. Right, Rich, and I guess I'll just it's obviously not about me, but I had a manager very early in my career as just a newly qualified accountant. I had an interview. He asked me a question I didn't know, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't know, and I got the job. And the feedback was, we knew we could trust you because you weren't going to give us some nonsense. So for me, that was really powerful. So I guess that's some feedback to our members. It is being comfortable and being willing to say, I don't know, and say, let me take that away and I'll come back to you. So yeah. Thank you very much, Rich. It's been really, really insightful. You've given us some fantastic stuff to take away. We will circle back through CMI in some of the models and names and quotes that we've mentioned. Thank you very much for joining us today, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Catherine, for the invitation, and thank you very much for everybody for dialing in.
Perfect. So that's all for today's session. Thank you to our host, Catherine, and to also our speakers, Richard and David, for your insight and expertise. Please stay tuned to hear more about CMI membership, and thank you for joining us.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.